Hi, my name is Meredith. Today I'm going to be giving you 5 tips for what to look for when you're rereading your first draft and you're developing an editing plan. These are going to be some things to identify and to go back and fix when you actually start editing. So this past year, I read back through my first draft of my novel. I'm reading through a friend's first draft of a novel, and I'm beta reading for someone. So I'm getting a lot of first draft writing. And I've noticed some things that are consistent between all these drafts. There's signs of getting everything out on the page, exploring while you're writing, all of those things that you should be doing in a first draft, but that make it messy, and that are things that now that you're on the reread, you need to go back and clean up. The first thing I want to talk about is info dumping. So we all know the common advice that you're not supposed to info dump, and that a really good way to fix it is to sprinkle in that narrative paragraph of info dumping that you would have done and bring it into dialogue, have different characters say it. So this can be really good advice, but what I noticed is that by staying away from the paragraph of narrative info dumping, it creates scenes where there's just info dumping of dialogue. And so usually this happens when a protagonist is walking into a new environment or a new situation where they have to do something they've never done before, and there's a character who knows about this thing and they are explaining everything to this character. And I think as writers, we do this because we are trying to get our own thoughts out, but we're trying to stay away from info dumping. And so we're like, okay, we'll have a character say all of these thoughts. But really, the writer is speaking to the reader and saying, here are all the things that you need to know about this new environment. And actually, readers don't need quite that much. So when you're rereading, look for passages when this doesn't advance the plot, when this does not build character, when maybe it's doing a tiny bit of relationship building, but really it's not, because it's just about information. I think one of the best fixes is to take that information, figure out what you can cut, and take out all of the extra stuff. And anything that's still left that you really think is essential information, now you can still have a little bit of that in dialogue, because it's normal for someone who knows something to explain something to someone who doesn't. But we also don't want to bore people. So allow the information to get sprinkled throughout the scene. Hopefully the scene is proactive, the hero is here to do something, to participate in some way. You can have that in pieces of dialogue that people tell them as relevant things come up. So maybe the character asks a question and it gets answered. What you can also do is you can include sensory details. There's a lot you can pick up by context clues that people don't need to tell you. There are a lot of visual cues and audio clues. And so you can filter a lot of that information and give it to the reader by having the protagonist just understand it by the environment that they're in, and it doesn't have to be said by somebody else. So see if you can incorporate this new information that's really, really important and that you can't cut in a much more natural way. Tip number 2. This is about broad, big structure, big overview. And I've said this in a couple of videos, but I really, really suggest reverse outlining, because even if you've written with an outline, although a lot of people write first drafts without outline, so if you've done that, this is also a good place to start. But even if you've written an outline, you make this reverse outline, you write down your really basic plot points of what you actually did write, what you ended up putting down, not what your outline said you should. Write down either a page count or a word count of how long the plot stayed in one phase. And then you look at kind of the percentages and you see what stuff was way too long, what stuff you went off and just, went on a tangent. Maybe you had 4 extra plot points in the fun and games and it's way too long, but you love all of it. But now you know you have to condense it somehow. So writing out this big reverse outline will help you see what you actually did, and now on a big picture scale, what you need to change or cut down, or maybe you need to add something. And this is something that I did with my own book and with both of the books that I read for other people, because it really, really helps just see like, okay, well, so here's what you actually have. Here's where, oh, things went off the rails. I need to roll this back. So super helpful tip. Okay. Tip number 3 is a little bit more detailed, so it depends on where you are in your editing process. But I have found in a lot of the conversations that I wrote that sometimes in conversation, we have people who are not acting consistent to their motivations or what those motivations should be. Or a lot of times we don't even know the motivation. We just know the goal of the scene from our writing perspective, but we're not looking at the actual motivations of those characters, why those characters are having a conversation. They're having a conversation because the writer told them to, but why do they want to have a conversation? And so I find that when you don't know the individual motivations of each character in each conversation or each scene, things get really messy. So a character could either get irrationally angry, or maybe they're just way too playful when something really should have bothered them a little bit more. And maybe their mood shifts really quickly throughout the course of the conversation because they're all over the place. They don't know their goal in the conversation. They don't know how they feel about this person because you as the writer have no idea how they feel about this person. And when you go back to do the edit, look at each of the different characters' motivations for specifically engaging in this conversation. Why would they walk up to that person and start a conversation? And what would they hope to get out of it? Draw back and figure it out before you start to edit that conversation. The fourth tip as you're rereading is to look for places where you have unfulfilled promises. This can look like a lot of different things. It's something that stands out in the reader's brain and says, I'm going to come back to this. It could be a thought that a character has about another person. It could be a line of dialogue. It could be an actual promise. It can also be something like a piece of world building that you really focus on, that the reader is now expecting, okay, I'm going to remember this because this is probably coming back in the climax or somewhere in the ending, and it's going to make a big difference. Or maybe it's part of the plot twist, or maybe it's an object that the character found that you found really cool as a writer, but actually doesn't matter for the plot. And now the reader's hung up on it and they're thinking, where is this going to come into the story? And it never does. And it's okay to world build, it's okay to throw in cool things, but when you put enough emphasis on it that the reader's now expecting it to be important, that is when it's going to divert your reader's attention. And also disappoint them when that thing is never used. And that's really what it's about, is rising to your reader's expectations. And, what you ultimately want to do is exceed them, but when you're looking to edit the first draft, all you really want to do is just see if you can meet them first. So things like that are promises that are unfulfilled, that you made, that now you need to decide, do I fulfill this promise and put this into the rest of the book, or do I cut this promise? So as you're going through your manuscript, I would suggest marking all of those places where you have an unfulfilled promise, or maybe even just where you have a promise. And so that as you read the rest of the book, you can actually figure out, did I fulfill this promise? And if not, what should I do about it? Okay, tip number 5 is to cut out connective tissue between scenes. I definitely had so much of this in my first draft, and I think this is a really common problem where you're writing a scene and you didn't quite have an idea in mind for where it exactly needed to stop, and so you just kept writing. You meandered, you maybe wrote in the character's bedtime routine because you needed to get it to what felt like in your mind a good stopping place, or you kept a conversation going way too long. You kept it going all the way to the pleasantries and the goodbyes and the we'll meet up next Tuesday at 3 p.m. when you don't need any of that. When you can cut the scene right when the important stuff stops happening, all of those fluffy parts of conversations that is not creating character development, it is not developing a relationship, it is not moving the plot forward, can be easily cut. And those are some parts that maybe fall into the category of kill your darlings, but I also think that it is such an easy way to clean up your novel. And you can just go right in and do some surgery, cut out that connective tissue that does not belong and that the reader, I promise you, will skim because they're looking for the next exciting thing. So just go to the next exciting thing. And so that's okay to find a lot of that stuff in a first draft. I have so much of it in mine. I think you can avoid a lot of that with some careful beforehand planning. And so with my rewrite that I wrote, there's a lot less of it because I was planning out, exactly where my scenes were going to end and all that stuff. But there's still some times where I just meandered on and just wanted to complete it in my brain. It also makes the pacing a lot faster if you do cut that stuff because you don't have this big dip in your reader's interest. You can just take them from something important to something exciting rather than having something kind of boring in the middle. So be on the lookout for that as you read through your first draft. Okay, those are the 5 tips that I have for you today on things to look for when you go back to read your first draft and create an editing plan, and things to tackle when you actually get into the edits. As I keep reading through these manuscripts, and now I have 2 more manuscripts of my own that I've written this year to read back through next year, hopefully I'll come up with more of these tips because I think that there are a lot of these things that are just pretty common with first drafts. It's just like, it's kind of a natural thing for your brain to want to do, is to connect things and to just meander a little bit and to be confused at points, or to be extra creative and create loose threads and promises that you don't fulfill. So it's completely normal, but there are also things that you can easily target when you're going back into your edits. So hopefully I will find some more of these and maybe do another video once I've read a couple more first drafts. I wish you the best with rereading your first drafts and getting into the scary process of really going through and editing and making this thing better. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the content, and subscribe to see more from me. I post videos twice a week. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.